Well, thank you. Today I'm here along with the Premier, Mr. Sawney, and we will be providing an update on the flood situation in Wood Buffalo and Mackenzie County and information on new supports available for evacuees. Working closely with our municipal partners, the province continues to respond to the flood events in northern Alberta. These events have resulted in approximately 13,000 people being evacuated from the Fort McMurray area and approximately 450 people evacuated from Fort Vermilion and the Tall Cree First Nation. In response to this emergency, we have seen shining examples of what makes these communities strong, folks looking out for each other and neighbors helping neighbors. Unfortunately, a fast-moving emergency also creates an opportunity for the spread of rumors and for false information, and I'd like to address one piece of information in particular in regards to the tailing ponds. No tailing ponds have been breached, and there is no imminent risk of flood water breaching any of the tailing ponds in the oil sands region. Currently, floodwaters remain below the dams for all tailing ponds, and monitoring has been increased to twice daily to ensure stability and risk associated with all tailing ponds. The AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator, is holding daily calls with operators to discuss the flood situation and has regulatory agents on site conducting field verifications and closely monitoring the company's actions to ensure the situation remains stable. Suncor has current and up-to-date strategies in place, and the companies have equipment available to respond if required. Further response strategies do exist in the event circumstances were to change significantly from the current state. But I want to reiterate, things would have to change significantly, and the situation around tailing ponds is stable. This is good news. There's also further good news when it comes to the flooding in the north. The situation appears to be improving. Alberta Environment River Forecast Center's report that water levels within the jam are dropping. In fact, the water level gauge located within the jam by Highway 63 bridge has shown a drop in the Athabasca River by half a meter since last night. They have also observed that 4 kilometers of the ice jam melted away overnight. We know that the ice jam is showing some movement this morning, so things are looking up. I will wrap up my comments by repeating what I said yesterday regarding the common theme throughout every emergency that Alberta has faced. We are in it together. We will work together. We are resilient people, and we stand by our neighbours. I will now turn things over to the Premier for an update on support for evacuees.
Thank you, Jason, and I'm also pleased to be here with the Minister for Community and Social Services, Rajan Sawhney, as well as the Executive Director of the Alberta Emergency Management Agency, Shane Schreiber. And thank you, Jason, for that update. We continue to be in hour-by-hour contact with officials in Wood Buffalo and Mackenzie County, both with Mayor Don Scott in Fort McMurray and Mackenzie County Reeve Josh Knelson, and the Provincial Operations Centre of the Alberta Emergency Management Agency is working very closely with the local emergency management personnel. We are encouraged to see the ice jams are beginning to clear on both the Athabasca and the Peace Rivers, and that water volumes are starting to go down, and are hopeful that in the next 48 to 72 hours, we'll see a significant abatement of the flood conditions in both Fort McMurray, Fort Vermilion, and elsewhere. So I would like to commend all of the first responders, all of the emergency personnel, and others who have been working around the clock, as we saw in Fort McMurray on Monday, to keep people safe. And our hearts go out to all of those whose homes or businesses have been affected by these floods. As I said in Fort McMurray earlier this week, it's just unthinkable that some of the folks who've just rebuilt their homes over the past 4 years, following the terrible wildfires of 2016, now see those very same homes, in some cases, underwater. And people whose life savings are tied up in their businesses to see those businesses partly underwater in those communities at a time that was already incredibly challenging with the economic adversity plus the pandemic, it is just too much for, I think, some people to bear. But we want them to know that the government and the people of Alberta stand with them, and we are providing every possible support to them. That is why I am here today to announce that the government of Alberta will be extending emergency evacuation cash payments to evacuees from the northern floods in the amount of $1,250 for adults and $500 for minors under the age of 18. We estimate that this will represent a emergency cash payments for a one-week installment of $11.7 million. Those payments will be available for application through My Alberta starting this upcoming Monday. And as in the past, as we've done with wildfire and flood situations for emergency evacuation payments, those will be automatic electronic transfers so that people can get that cash in hand just as quick as possible to cover some of the essential costs of living while they're dealing with all of the displacement and the challenges of living as evacuees. I should underscore that these folks generally have been housed in local hotels. Many folks from the Fort McMurray evacuation have been put into hotels in the south side of town. I understand that those hotels are now full, and then some people are being offered hotel space further south, including in Edmonton. And the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo is covering the initial costs. In due course, we will work out provincial cost sharing with Wood Buffalo in the emergency response. And as I indicated to Mayor Scott, we believe that given the 1 in 100-year nature of this disaster, that it will qualify for the Alberta Disaster Recovery Program. So as I say, the province will be there in a very real way. So, folks, I guess this is important to underscore that people are not having to be cash out of hand to pay for their own accommodation right now. My understanding is that bills for those hotel rooms go directly to Wood Buffalo, and I believe the same is the case for Mackenzie County for Fort Vermilion evacuees, and Minister Sani can provide additional details. So the key point here is that we stand behind these folks, that help is there, and it will be following through with these emergency evacuation payments. I'd also like to thank Prime Minister Trudeau for having called me earlier today to express his concern and that of the Government of Canada for the people affected by these ice jams and floods in northern Alberta. He acknowledged with me that these communities have already been through enough, and it's just tragic to see yet another adversity thrown at people in northern Alberta, particularly in Fort McMurray. The Prime Minister did extend an offer of federal assistance, and I thanked him on behalf of the Government of Alberta for that offer. At this point, we believe that there's adequate logistical support to support those communities between the municipal governments and the Government of Alberta. At this point, we have not received any formal request from either municipality for federal logistical support, but should it be forthcoming, we would obviously pass that on to the federal authorities. And with that, Minister Nixon, Minister Sani and I, and Mr. Schreiber are available for questions.
Thank you, Premier. Operator, can you please put through the first caller?
First caller is Kelly Kreiderman, Golden Bell. Please go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my question. This question might be for Mr. Schreiber. I'm wondering if you could go through some of the difficulties of doing an evacuation like this for thousands of people in the midst of a pandemic. It sounds like most people are in hotel rooms, but it was my understanding that people might also be housed in camps. Are there concerns about the virus, given the movement of people, given that they might be housed in those types of settings? And are people resisting the evacuation orders in any major way?
Yeah. So there are several precautions that we use when you have to evacuate under pandemic circumstances. So, for instance, people need to register and be screened before they go into accommodation, and so they're checked to make sure that they're asymptomatic. And then, of course, we use We use individual accommodation like hotel rooms, or in the camp setting, people would have individual dorm style or individual rooms as opposed to dorm style rooms. And we don't use the collective sheltering options like rinks with cots. So those are two of the things that we do. We make sure people have individual space, and we check them before they go in to make sure they're asymptomatic. That makes sure that we can be safe under COVID conditions. And sorry, the last part of your question?
Sorry, I was just wondering if there are a lot of people resisting the evacuation order. Also, if you are screening, are you finding cases of COVID as you do this evacuation? Has that been a major issue to now?
Right. So I know of no cases that have been essentially positively identified at the screening process, and nobody has resisted. In fact, my hat's off to the people that were evacuated for the very calm and deliberate manner in which they left. So it's been really good to this point.
Operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
The next question is from Graham Thompson from My Politics. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for the Premier. Premier, in terms of the financial aid for people in Fort McMurray, I know that last week your cabinet authorized the Minister of Finance to borrow up to $25 billion. About 4 times, I believe, what you originally had planned on borrowing in the budget. So might this money be used to help people in Fort McMurray, and what else would that money be used for this year?
Well, to be clear, the Order in Council authorized the Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board to potentially borrow up to that amount in the forthcoming year, but that wasn't actually, he would still have to come back to Treasury Board for, obviously to the legislature to have appropriations adopted by the legislature to spend that money. So the money that we're announcing here today and any other emergency expenditures related to the northern floods would be coming out of the provincial budget line item for contingency, which is always set aside for emergencies such as this. I think this year it was $400 million, if I'm not mistaken, in the contingency budget for emergencies. So that's already embedded in the budget that was adopted by the legislature. But obviously, the costs here are just yet another extraordinary cost that the government of Alberta is absorbing in this very challenging year. As we've said before, we anticipate that the provincial deficit will move from a projected $6 billion to something in the range of $20 billion. And that's, look, we're not even halfway through the year. 2020 is throwing a lot of unknowns at us. That's our current best estimate. The finance minister will be providing a fiscal update to Albertans through the legislature this summer, as soon as we can get the legislature back to a regular business cycle. And we hope to have I anticipate there will be a summer session to make up for lost time this spring. And I've asked the Minister Tays to prepare a fiscal update. It will be a moving target, obviously, and the biggest part of the increase in the deficit relates to the collapse in revenues, not just non-renewable resource revenues and royalties, but the general economic collapse that we've seen emanating from the global coronavirus recession. But having said all of that, I have, we in the first 2 or 3 weeks following the beginning of the pandemic and the collapse of oil prices, we saw we had a frankly a real challenge in selling provincial government bonds and turning over our debt. We were not the only province to have such a problem, by the way. It was, I think, a general constraint in credit markets. But I'm pleased to report that we're now, I think, the credit markets have unfrozen, and we've been able to sell bonds and to develop a cash reserve for the balance of the year because of all of these exigent circumstances, including the floods now.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
The next question is from Heather Ewers, Global News. Please go ahead.
Hi there. Yes, thanks for taking my question. If you could just elaborate a little bit on what, Mr. Premier, what you mentioned on Twitter yesterday about Dr. Hinshaw relaxing public health orders for the municipality, and when will the community be receiving those masks?
Sure. Well, Dr. Hinshaw will be available to answer questions on that later today. In terms of receiving masks, I'll invite Mr. Schreiber because he oversees the Provincial Operations Centre, which is distributing PPE across the province, including to emergency responders dealing with the floods. So, Mr. Shane?
Hi. So we pushed a significant amount of masks. I think it was 100,000 to Fort McMurray yesterday. So they should have arrived last night or maybe this morning. And the same thing with Fort Vermilion. So we'll push them a significant amount of masks and other PPE so people can be safe, not just while they're evacuated, but also as we start to allow re-entry and do cleanup. Yeah. So so Dr. Hinshaw, because of the volunteers working to sandbag in some of the areas that are being affected by the flooding, because they have to be closer together than the social distancing recommended, Dr. Hinshaw essentially gave a waiver for them to be closer together, and also again we're going to get them protective equipment so that the risk is reduced.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
The next question is from Lisa Johnson, Post Media. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and thanks for the update on the estimate of what the emergency would cost the provincial government. I'm wondering, Mr. Premier, if you can comment on how this will affect, I mean, in general, big picture budgeting, knowing that the emergency fund, the $750 million emergency fund that was originally set aside for flooding and fires, has been tentatively reallocated towards the COVID-19 response. I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yeah. By the way, thanks for correcting me. You're right. It's $750 million that was set aside for contingencies such as this in the budget, not $400 million. I was thinking about the previous year. We actually did increase the amount in this year's budget because there has been a tendency for years and years for Alberta to significantly overshoot our emergency response spending in terms of what versus what had been budgeted. So you're right. It is $750 million. Now, you may recall that the legislature, we did propose and the legislature adopted an additional $500 million in funding for Alberta Health Services to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we did that just a few weeks ago as the pandemic was starting to spread here in Alberta. And we made it clear to Alberta Health and other departments involved in the pandemic response that they just need to let the government know if and when they need additional resources. To be honest, we do not yet have clear estimates on how much the pandemic response is going to cost overall because we're still right in the middle of it. So we're just dealing with the emergency on a day-by-day basis, but obviously the $500 million injection into the health budget has helped a lot. In terms of the floods, we don't have, it's really too early to come up with an accurate estimate on costs. When I was up in Fort McMurray the other day, municipal officials were saying they thought it would be, the response would be at least north of $30 million based on previous experiences, and that's just the emergency response. Then there will be the need for rebuild, and as I've said, we believe that the criteria have been triggered for us to bring in the disaster recovery program, whereby the provincial government would provide some financial support for recovery costs for critical public infrastructure and non-insured private infrastructure up to a certain amount. We would then turn to the Government of Canada through the disaster financial arrangements, disaster financial assistance arrangements, and they would provide some cost sharing as well. So there are well-developed protocols for cost sharing between municipalities, the provincial and federal governments in response to a situation like this. Given the gravity of the flood, at least the one in Wood Buffalo, it's estimated by the river experts to be a 1 in a 100-year event, so it would certainly qualify in principle for the disaster recovery program. So it's too early to say how much this is all going to cost, but this is a unprecedented year in many ways, one of which will be the fiscal reckoning at the end of it all.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
The next question is from Brian Rashad, TSN. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this question is for Premier Kenney. Mr. Premier, just a couple of sports related, if you don't mind. There was a report that the CFL is leaning on the federal government for up to $30 million in funding, up to $150 potentially if the season is canceled. If I could just get your thoughts on two businesses, high profile in the province, and the Stampeders and the Eskimos, and their need for some federal help. And then also if there's been any more contact with either the National Hockey League or specifically the Edmonton Oilers about starting to take a look to see what might be feasible towards the end of summer as far as Edmonton hosting some hockey.
Well, first of all, the Canadian Football League is an important national institution, and the Esks and Stamps are important Alberta institutions. A lot of Albertans would say the Saskatchewan Rough Riders are too, by the way. And so I certainly am sympathetic to the request from the Canadian Football League. We want the league to come out of this as a vibrant part of Canada's sports life. And so I wasn't aware of their request, but I'll take a look at that. And I have not personally received any communications from the Stamps or the Eskimos, but we'd be happy to reach out to them and see how they're coping through this, because obviously the season this year is going to be at least somehow compromised. On the question of the NHL, as you know, I did have a conversation with Commissioner Bettman about a week ago, and it was a general conversation about the potential for Alberta to host some games to wrap up this year's NHL season. I think the league wants to award a cup this year, and if we could do that safely in Alberta, I think that would be awesome. We'd have to make sure that all of the health protocols are followed very rigorously, and given the professionalism and the resources of the league, I'm confident they could come forward with a detailed proposal that for consideration by our public health officials. We have not yet received such a detailed proposal. I have not had any further discussions with the NHL since last week. My office continues to be in touch with the Edmonton Oilers, however, and I think conversations continue between them and the league.
Operator, can you please put through the next caller?
The next question is from Kenney Triton, CFL. Please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Good afternoon, Mr. Premier. A couple of questions here. You were talking about the disaster relief fund for the Fort McMurray Wood Buffalo area. Question number one, would any type of relief under that program be available for the Mackenzie region? And also, in terms of oil prices, given your experience and what you've seen in the past, given the glutton of supply out there, when do you think that the supply and demand curves will get a little closer to each other, given the fact that the market's flooded right now?
Sure. On the first question, I have not yet received an assessment about the Mackenzie County floods in historical terms, or whether I've not yet received technical advice on whether the situation around Fort Vermilion, would qualify for the disaster recovery program. I did speak to Reeve Knelson and his chief administrative officer on Sunday night, I believe it was, or Monday night, and frankly, they're just so focused on emergency response that we haven't really talked about future potential recovery costs. But listen, obviously, if for Mackenzie County's flood qualifies, then we will include them in the disaster recovery program to provide provincial financial support. On the second question about energy markets, as you know, we continue to see extraordinarily low prices. Yesterday, WTI was trading at $12 and WCS in the $3 range. Our best intelligence is that those extremely depressed prices are likely to continue for the better part of a year, at least, given global inventories. Here's the problem. Global energy demand, because of the COVID recession, is off by at least 30%. And because OPEC and Russia maintained, or in some cases increased, supply in the face of that catastrophic reduction in demand, we've ended up with global inventories approaching tank tops. I'm told by our Energy Minister, Sonia Savage, that there are fleets of oil tankers out, now basically moored off the U.S. Gulf Coast that are filled to the gunnels, and they have nowhere to unload. So the inventories are actually not just on land, but they're on the open seas as well. And this is why we've seen these extremely depressed prices. So two things are going to happen. First of all, post-pandemic, we're going to see global demand and energy consumption increase. Eventually, global economies are going to come back to something like normal. People will start to travel by air again, and we'll see demand go back up. And then secondly, we are seeing a significant reduction in supply now. There's the 9.7 million barrels per day of reduced production that was announced by OPEC Plus 2 weeks ago. And in addition to that, we estimate millions of barrels a day coming off in North America and other jurisdictions outside OPEC Plus. So I think our best intelligence is that we will be dealing with a low price environment for probably 12 to 18 months. I hope that's wrong. I hope that the global economy recovers more strongly and more quickly. And I hope that uneconomic oil production comes off permanently, and that OPEC Plus have learned the lesson. And I think there is light at the end of the tunnel for Canada and for Alberta in all of this, because our oil sands in particular are much more capital efficient than U.S. shale. Because they have to constantly drill and spend money on exploration just to be able to produce, whereas the oil sands are long-lasting reservoirs and assets. Once you build them, you can produce for 20 or 30 years. So we believe that we're going to survive through this and come out stronger at the other end of it, but that may take 18 months or so.
Okay, we have time for two more. Operator, can you please put through the next question?
The next question is from Tom Vernon, Global News. Please go ahead.
Hi, Premier. I want to build on that last question. In your conversations with the Prime Minister, has there been any more movement on federal support for oil and gas companies? You've said in the past that more liquidity is needed.
Regrettably, there has been no further action. Tom, you may recall that Finance Minister Morneau said, I think 3 to 4 weeks ago, that a major federal package for the oil and gas industry would be coming within hours or days. Well, we're now moving into our second month waiting for that significant federal action. We do appreciate the announcement that was made about 10 days ago, which included the $1.7 billion for accelerated well completion, as well as $700 million to help the industry reduce methane emissions and modernize its technology, as well as a meaningful backstop for small and mid-sized oil and gas companies being delivered by BDC. And we estimate that backstop may have a value of several $billion, and that is helpful. But obviously, all of our energy companies are hemorrhaging cash right now. And a bigger response is needed, not just for oil and gas producers and in Canada, but also other massively affected industries like aviation. You know, for example, here in Alberta, we are the proud headquarters of a great Canadian airline, WestJet, and WestJet, like their competitors at Air Canada, are facing, I suspect, an existential challenge if they do not have some meaningful backstop support. So we will continue at every opportunity to raise the alarm with the federal government about the need for urgent action. Every chance I get to speak with the premiers and the Prime Minister, we have a weekly First Ministers meeting conference call. I hammer this point home. This is an industry that hires directly or indirectly 500,000 Canadians. It produces tens of billions of dollars of much-needed government revenue. It is the largest largest subsector of the Canadian economy. It is by far our largest export industry. Alberta was there to help ensure a future for the central Canadian auto manufacturers back in the global financial crisis 12 years ago. And Alberta's oil and gas industry helped to save the Canadian economy during the global financial crisis in 2008. And Albertans, after all that we've done, after the $600 billion net that we have given the rest of the country in recent decades, it's time for the rest of the country to be there for Alberta and the women and men who work in the energy sector. It's a message I just will continue to repeat. And I don't know what the holdup is, to be honest with you, Tom, and I think Albertans are starting to lose patience. We need to see action to help save our largest industry for another day.
All right, we have time for one more. Operator, can you please put through the last caller?
Next question is from Carol Ryan, Global News. Please go ahead.
Hi there. Sorry, Premier, I'm just looking for some clarification. Are you saying that you're not sure yet if the folks in Fort Vermilion qualify for the emergency financial cash? And the second question, Minister Nixon, you spoke about an update on the jam in the Wood Buffalo area. Can we get an update on the jam in the Peace River?
Sure. So on the first question, let me be absolutely clear. The folks who have had to evacuate Fort Vermilion and parts of Mackenzie County, all of them will qualify for the emergency evacuation payments of $1,250 per adult and $500 for those who are under the age of 18. They can apply at Your Alberta for those payments next Monday, and they can receive electronic transfers. So all of the roughly 450 evacuees in Mackenzie County will benefit from those payments. I was referring to a totally different program. It's called the Disaster Recovery Program, and that is provincial financial support for the post-emergency phase, when people have to rebuild some of the infrastructure, perhaps houses and businesses. That's a program that provides funding support for critical public infrastructure that might be owned by the municipality, for example, and for uninsured private property up to a certain amount. So I was just saying that I'm certain that given the 1 in 100-year scale of the jams and floods in Wood Buffalo, that municipality will qualify for the DRP. I'm not yet sure whether Mackenzie County will. We're obviously going to take a look at that, but all the folks will be receiving emergency evacuation payments, and Minister Nixon can give you an update, and perhaps Minister Schreiber, on the flood situation in Mackenzie County.
Yes, and just to add to what the Premier is saying in regards to Fort Vermilion, the river forecast team in Alberta Environment have indicated to me that it certainly does look like that is a 1 in 100-year flood. And yeah, exactly. And so we'll be looking at that in that context. The immediate work is around the immediate relief for evacuees, which the Premier spoke about today. And as we move into cleanup and recovery stage, we'll be having these conversations with the municipalities. In regards to Mackenzie County and Fort Vermilion, the news is very good. There was a melt out there sometime last night, and the remaining ice has begun to flow out of that community's area. The flooding has stopped within the community. I don't want to say that the emergency situation is over, because it's not. Obviously, we have to go through the process of getting the river out of town, or getting the water out of town and back into the river. Alberta Environment will be watching that remaining ice as it flows down the river. There's a point where the river narrows, where that ice does traditionally block in years past, and so we'll be watching that closely over the next couple of days to see how that may impact communities downstream. But at this point, we're not expecting a major impact as a result of that ice, and the focus inside Mackenzie County has gone to keeping care of evacuees and beginning to have the conversation about recovery and cleanup.
All right, thanks. We'll wrap it up there.